Hello everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Is this magic mic working? Wonderful. Okay, I'm Sarah, and today I'm going to be talking to you about neurodivergence, neurodiversity, and inclusion in technology. Thank you, first of all, for joining me in this last, I think, slot of the day, rather than running off home. Really do appreciate it. I'm going to share a bit of my story with you. I will try not to get too emotional, but what I hope you'll come away with from the session today is an understanding of what neurodiversity is, how we can be more inclusive generally, and how that can make things better for everyone around us. So first, though, I'd like to hear from some of you. Who knows what neurodiversity is? Okay, that's good. It's a good start. Does anyone not have a clue, and this is your first encounter with it? No idea what I'm talking about. Okay, one person over there. Good to know. And did anyone come to the session today with a specific challenge or question? Okay, it's good to know. So first I'm going to just introduce myself. I currently work at YouGov, which you may have heard of. It's famous for political polling, but we do a lot of market research. We're a tech platform company, and I look after the team that looks after our members. So there are 22 million of them around the world. When they're angry, they tell me. When they're happy, they tell me. And my job is basically to keep those guys happy. 1 in 7, on average, of the population are neurodivergent. And this means that we think, we behave, and we learn differently to normal. I hate the word normal. There's no such thing. But I mean we fall outside of the high bit on a bell curve. Some of the terms, some of the diagnoses you might have come across. ADHD, that's mine. Dyslexia, it's a pretty common one. Autism spectrum, Asperger's and variations, dyspraxia, hyperlexia is often the one people haven't heard of, and a lot more. And all of those things together are collectively known as neurodiversity, neurodivergence. And mental health is a key part of this as well. So up to 70% of neurodivergent people also have a mental health condition, and often the two things are confused for each other. So, for example, before I got my ADHD diagnosis, I was misdiagnosed with anxiety and depression for years, and I was on medication for that, and after I got my diagnosis, I was able to come off that for the first time in 15 years, so it made a huge difference to my life. That's particularly common in women. Women just tend to be given antidepressants as a solution for everything. But 70% is a massive correlation. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is caused by the other, but the challenges of living in a world that's not really designed around you can cause those mental health conditions as well. Trauma reactions. So there's been a lot more in the news on things like Instagram, social media blogs recently about what trauma looks like and the impact of childhood trauma on your behaviors, on the way your brain is wired. And that too can look very similar in terms of the way that people behave. So even if you don't know anybody who is neurodivergent, or you haven't come across that at work, or you don't have friends and family, the likelihood of you having met somebody that's got a mental health condition, that's experienced some sort of trauma, or has a neurodivergent condition is pretty high. And my hope is that the tips and stuff I'm going to share with you today are useful in those cases as well. So we literally see the world differently. And I'm going to read a quote that really resonated with me when I started exploring this, because I think it's important that we don't just talk about the challenges of these conditions, we also talk about the amazing aspects of them too. So about 35% of the neurodivergent population has extremely high creativity, complex problem-solving skills, data and technology acumen, aptitude, and interest. When acumen, aptitude, and interest line up like a constellation in the sky, it creates a level of focus. That employee will outperform anyone that you have in this space. In a global competition for the best talent, these are the people that you want in your workforce. But it's not all sunshine and roses. So the world is mostly, not entirely, but mostly built by and for neurotypical people. For me, I've described it before as being a bit like a square peg in a round hole. Several years ago, I was working for a software house, and my boss at the time told me that the business had a Sarah-shaped hole in it, which I took to be quite the compliment. You know, I was doing something nobody else could do. And about 6 months later, I was no longer in that job because I didn't play well with other people. I've learned, I've got way better at this, but I've been through some crap because of how my brain is wired. The world, by and large, is built by and for the norm, right? It is a bell curve. And we are on the edges. And we can't expect the world to change around us. The world, the systems that we have, it would be wonderful, but it's unlikely. It's built for the middle, built for the center. But that doesn't mean that small changes that can benefit everyone don't make a big difference. Do you know what spiky profiles are? Anyone familiar with this concept? A couple of people, that's really good. Okay, so this is a neurotypical profile. So you can see it's an absolutely stunning radar type chart, and it shows a person's abilities or level of ability in certain areas. So things like emotional control, flexibility, planning, prioritization, problem solving, goal-directed persistence. Response, inhibition, vision. It's pretty nice shape. This is actually my partner's, who is neurotypical. This is mine. It's very spiky. I am absolutely brilliant at some things. Proper 99th percentile, exceptional. Awful, like truly awful at others. There's sort of not really a middle ground with a lot of this. And yes, as I said, we can learn, we can get better, we can improve, and that's good. And over time, I have had to work really hard in some of these areas to get better, but it's harder. Your baseline is different. I'm sure there are people here who have heard or come across the whole trope of, you know, with superpowers come kryptonite. Sounding familiar? So every positive thing has a negative or opposite reaction. So for me, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, yes, there are some superpowers. There are some things I'm really good at. And there's also the kryptonite, which is the flip side of that and the impact that that can have. So I'm going to give you some examples of spiky people that I've worked with. A chap called James, dyspraxic, on the autistic spectrum. He'd come to work back in the days when we were all in offices. He shaved, but he missed bits. He would have his collar kind of all over the place, half of it sticking up, half of it not. He had a very unusual way of speaking, very unusual cadence, a kind of nervous energy. And he is one of the most brilliant engineers I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot of software engineers. Another James, another ball of nervous energy. He would walk around, he'd just fiddle with his watch constantly. And he was passionate about some unusual things. He did his dissertation on terrorism. He did a master's in war studies. He was socially awkward, and he is still one of the best research minds that I've met. And another one, Jo, also had ADHD. She was always late, scatty, chaotic, and somehow, even though she was always late for things, always had time to have flawless makeup. And I'm similar, and I'll talk about why that is in a minute. But she could lead and motivate and engage a team like no one else I've met. She just instinctively understood people. Her empathy levels were off the charts, and she got that team through some restructures, difficult challenges, in spite of being the kind of person that is always late for meetings. So for me, that spiky profile in practice looks like joining the dots super fast. So when I joined YouGov, one of the things I most commonly heard from people as feedback was, wow, damn, you're fast. And by that, I mean, I can get under the skin of a company, understand how it works in reality, not just looking at an org chart, understand how people work. I can walk into a meeting and have played out in my head how it's going to end, like a flow chart. But I forget to eat. So I actually haven't eaten for 24 hours, I've just realized. And sometimes I'll be working, I'll be concentrating on something, and my husband will literally come and bring me food, and I couldn't tell you what I've eaten, but I know I've eaten it. And it's tricky and weird, and as a grown-ass adult, thinking that you have to set an alarm on your phone to remind yourself to eat and have a drink sounds unusual, but it's what I do. I am consistently late. It's called time blindness, if you want to Google it. It is an actual thing. But that means I don't do well in roles that require a fixed start time. So it might have been a while, but has anybody here worked in an office? Right. So who's noticed when somebody rocks up at 10 o'clock or 10:30? I just kind of side-eyed them as they wander in after everybody else. And who's noticed when the same person is in the office till 8 o'clock at night? Everybody notices the early birds, the ones that are fighting for the car parking spaces. We notice the morning people. We don't notice the night owls because everybody's gone at 5 o'clock. Once, again, back in the days when we worked in an office, I ended up working so late that I set off the intruder alarm, which was definitely a highlight of my career so far. And I had to deal with security who were like, what the hell are you still doing here? It's nighttime. But I was focused. I also fell asleep on I had a sofa in my office in another role, fell asleep on that. My husband ended up coming in to literally wake me up because I didn't want to stop the thing I was doing, but I knew I was tired and needed a nap, so I had one. So when I'm hyper-focused on something, I won't rest until it's done, and I literally can't drag myself away. But the lateness has caused me challenges. My boss is a stickler for timekeeping, punctuality, so to address his need for that respect, for me to be on time, and my inability to be on time, we start meetings at random times. So instead of a meeting starting at 3 p.m., it'll start at 3:07 p.m. Or sometimes it's 3:03 p.m. It's always different, but it's enough to be a little bit unusual and make sure that I am there on time. And that's something that he was frustrated. We met, we talked. I sent him some papers on time blindness. He read them. We discussed it, and that's a solution that we came up with together that works for me and works for him and makes sure that both of our needs are met and both of us feel respected. passionate and articulate, two words I've been called frequently, but also unpredictable and prone to emotional outbursts. Now, they can be extremely embarrassing. I've had meetings where you just sort of feel like you're gonna well up, explode, get hot, chest goes red, anxiety goes through the roof. And I was really lucky in one role. I had a very good friend at work who could spot the signs, and she would do things like ask for a break when she saw me getting overwhelmed. So, because I couldn't advocate for myself at that point, but she could advocate for me. And having somebody that can spot those signs and support you is incredibly valuable. And then finally, struggling to start but not knowing when to stop. If you take this deck, this presentation, I was working on this morning. Annette, when I turned up earlier, was like, "What were you doing up at midnight asking me for Dungeons and Dragons artwork? You were supposed to have the presentation done a week ago." Of course I was. Right till the last minute. It got done, but I needed that pressure of a deadline to get started. And when you combine that with an optimism about how long something's going to take, you can frequently find yourself up to the early hours of the morning, because one time you got a presentation done in an hour, so that of course means you will always take an hour, and actually it takes closer to 4. So I've touched on these a little bit. So these are some superpowers or strengths. So the same things that create that chaotic, always late, unable to get started-ness that I have, also give me these things. So pattern detection, empathy baseline, these kind of create a bit of a spidey sense. So, sometimes you'll get a vibe that something's off. So it could be, I don't know, you feel like something's not right at work or in your team or with somebody, in your relationship, in a friendship. You kind of get a spidey sense. And it comes from having grown up in a world where you have to, you learn to adapt yourself to what normal looks like. You learn to mask, and you learn to be really, really, really good at spotting when things aren't quite right. And for me, that spidey sense has been useful. It means that I've been able to build good relationships with my teams, and create like a culture where people feel like they're listened to, they're heard, they're understood. And on the left-hand side, hyperfocus. So it can take the form of going down the Wikipedia rabbit hole, which might sound familiar to some people here, where you might start by looking up, I don't know, where the word trousers comes from. And you end up learning about etymology and the origin of words in general, and how exciting that is. You could pass hours doing that. But it's also really valuable when it comes to work, right? It means if something's interesting, I can get it done, focus on it, get it delivered. And if you combine the hyperfocus, the empathy, systems thinking, problem-solving ability together, with an element of passion, ability to articulate, ability to persuade, it's quite powerful. And I find in my current role that there are a few people, it's a bit of a niche, there are a few people that have got the willingness or the inclination or the curiosity to really understand something in depth, and the ability to simplify that and communicate that in a way that might make sense to a 5-year-old. That's a skill that not many people have. It's a skill I have, and it's one that's been really valuable to me in my career so far. Anyone familiar with executive functions? Good. So there are 7, 8, 11, or 12, depending on which research paper or you read or which researcher you ask. And these are the 7 I'm going to talk about today. So working memory is basically like your RAM. So it's your ability to hold and manipulate information in the mind for a short period of time. So it's not like your SSD or long-term storage, it's your RAM. Response inhibition, I'm going to talk about in a second. This is like your brakes. It's your ability to stop yourself doing something stupid and self-destructive. Most people have this. Most people are aware that keeping your mouth shut is sometimes an important thing to do. It is not a skill I have. It's the ability to control your impulses, to ignore distractions, to not go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole because it presents itself to you. Cognitive flexibility is an area I'm quite strong. It's context switching. It's the ability to switch between different tasks without having to slow down and kind of reboot yourself. It looks like really quick multitasking, but you're not really multitasking. You're just moving from one thing to another really quickly. But it's a very fast single thread. Planning and organisation is very commonly a challenge for those of us with these interesting brains. It is exactly how it sounds. It's the ability to create a plan or a strategy and actually stick to it, see it through. Metacognition, anyone familiar with that? A couple of people, okay. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So it's the ability to think about your own thought processes, to think, is that a feeling, like an actual feeling, or is it a thought that I'm having about a feeling? Am I feeling something physically in my body here? Or am I thinking something and calling it a feeling? Like the ability to think about how you're behaving and what you're thinking in that moment, kind of be self-aware. Time management, I've touched on already. Definitely an executive function, absolutely a challenge. And then finally, emotional regulation, very much related to response inhibition. This is the ability, as it sounds, to regulate your own emotions, manage stress, anxiety, frustration, and cope with emotional challenges. And I've made the kryptonite a dragon egg in honor of the theme for the conference. I'm going to talk about my kryptonite now. And it's response inhibition and emotional regulation. I literally don't have the wiring for my logical brain to kick in when I'm triggered or when I'm upset by something. So I overreact. I'll react completely irrational to something tiny, and then I'll go through what's basically called the shame cycle, where I look back at my behavior and I think, oh my God, what was I thinking? But at the time, it feels like the most important thing in the world to react the way I do. It feels like the emotion is real, the pain is real, the rejection is real, whatever it is that's triggered it. And it's been described to me as having a brain of a race car and the brakes of a bike. So you're going really, 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 really fast, but you can't stop yourself quickly enough. You can't control your tongue, urges, and it can get you in, it certainly got me in a lot of trouble over the years. So has anybody got an example of a noise that drives you crazy? So for me, it's people chewing. If somebody's chewing food loudly in front of me, I can't cope with that. It drives me bonkers. Any other examples?
It's going to sound a bit weird, but having to turn the microwave off when I'm not using it because the LED makes very slight buzzes.
It does. It does. Yeah, I totally get that one. How about you?
Metal scratches. Chair wobble floor, metal scratches.
Oh, yeah. That's, metal chairs scraping a floor. Anyone else?
Plastic, like screeching, like the styrofoam, you know, the packaging.
Oh, yes. It makes a squeak noise, doesn't it? Yeah, it's awful. Styrofoam, that was. Polystyrene, I think. Yeah.
People shouting.
Yeah. That was people shouting. It's just, does it make you feel rah? Yeah. No, I can see that.
Absolutely any disturbance when I'm coding,
Okay.
apart from the radio. I have the radio on classic when I'm coding. Anything else, dog barking, bin men, people coming to the door, anything, I'm fine.
When you're
Straight away.
focused, it's hard. Yeah, that was pretty much anything other than classic FM
Yeah.
when you're coding. Yeah. So it could be dogs barking, it could be babies crying, it could be people slurping soup. I've had that one before. Chewing salad. My best friend has a massive aversion to chewing salad, and that's what her partner eats every day. So you can imagine how their evenings go. Now, I want you to think about that sound for a second and think about how distracted it can make you feel and how irritated and how angry or anxious. And imagine if that was your baseline. So how I feel when somebody is chewing food loudly, or the sound of polystyrene being squeaked. If that was every day and you're constantly feeling like you're on this edge, your shoulders are up to your ears, you're tense, you're frustrated, your tongue's stuck to the roof of your mouth, all the things that we do when we're anxious, that's the baseline for a lot of people, neurodivergent people. And it can be really, really hard. So I'm going to talk through briefly, a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. You can Google it in your own time. Some things that have helped. So the SCARF model is a model of seeing the world by a guy called David Rock. And if you want a really good summary of this, ChatGPT has a great one. So you no longer have to Google, you can just ask the chatbot. And the SCARF model is about 5 domains of universal human experience. So these are things that trigger either a reward response in the brain or a threat response in the brain. Everybody, universally. Status is about your position in relation to other people. Certainty is about the predictability of the future. Autonomy is about having control over your environment, over your choices. Relatedness is about having a sense of safety with other people and how we interact with them. And fairness is a perception of justice and of like an impartial exchange between people. And when those things are triggered, it triggers a threat response in the brain, which in practice basically means that we release a stress hormone, cortisol, and that reduces the resources available for our brains to do things right, to do things rationally. There's literally less oxygen and glucose available for your brain to function. It reduces your working memory. It decreases your cognition. So it's a bit like you're hungover or you're really, really, really tired. You jump to conclusions. You generalize more easily. You make 2 and 2 equal 5. It increases defensive reactions. So lashing out could be one of those. And small stresses, so things that perhaps wouldn't normally bother you, not like the polystyrene example, are more likely to be perceived as larger stresses that are big and scary. And it's how we evolved, right? We were kind of, those who survived were the ones that were able to react quickly when the saber-toothed tiger was around. Because the ones that reacted slowly and kind of didn't get this threat response died and didn't pass on their genes. So when threatened, again, universally in humans, there's 4 responses. Fight, flight, and freeze are the ones that most people are familiar with. So fight is attacking, flight is running away. Freezing is literally being paralyzed and not knowing what to do. And the final one, which I didn't realize was a threat response until somebody told me I did this, is Fawn, which is where you go out of your way to soothe the thing that's causing the threat. So that can lead to a lack of boundaries. It can lead to over-functioning, over-giving in relationships so that that person doesn't run away. But it's basically abandoning yourself and hoping that that will be sufficient to make the threat go away. And I said that they are universal, but in neurodivergent people, all of that is magnified. And the reason it's magnified is because the little dragon is making noise. The polystyrene sound is already there in the background. So instead of starting here on a 0, you're already on a 5 when you wake up in the morning. And it doesn't take much to get you to a 10. So to go from a 10 to a 15 for you isn't a big jump. But to go from a 0 to a 15 for a neurotypical person is a massive jump. There's just far more chance of this happening because things are magnified. So what can help? Structure. So having structure in your day, like the alarm to remind you to eat. Having flexibility to start at a time that suits you. Being kind of made aware or having like a little code with your friends. So I've got a very, very good friend who can trigger me like nobody else. And we have basically a safe word, which is Armageddon. And if he notices me getting to a point where I'm clearly going to burst or overreact, he'll say that. It's like a short circuit in my brain to switch on a self-awareness that I otherwise wouldn't have. Energy fluctuations are normal for everybody, but they are higher and deeper for us. So an awareness of that being a factor is really important for me. I need big challenges, juicy things to get my teeth into. If I'm bored, I cause trouble. So the best thing for me is to not be bored, which means having big challenges, making sure I write things down. Clear expectations, good for everybody, but especially for neurodivergent people. And deadlines. I love a deadline. Not terribly good at planning to meet them, but I generally will get things done roughly on time. Space to decompress. So open plan offices were horrendous for, I imagine, most people, especially introverts. But having somewhere to go for a break, being able to put your headphones on and zone out from people is important. And then finally for me, a recognition that days vary. So sometimes I'll be the best employee you've got, and other times I'll be not far off the worst. And there's a trade-off. You don't get the good, super-duper high-performing, hyper-focused person without having some of that negative stuff too. And finally, inclusion makes things better for everyone, right? So yes, you have to do things differently, build things around each individual person, their unique needs, how they see the world, what they actually want. But flexible hours make things better for working parents. Flexible hours are a good thing. Flexible start times help people who are night owls. So not insisting that everybody's day starts at 8:30 helps people who are just better in the evenings. Headphone rules, like if you are in an office or a shared space, you have a rule like someone has earphones in, headphones in, they're not to be disturbed. That's not just good for neurodivergent people, it's also good for introverts. Inclusion isn't about doing things differently for certain groups of people. You can do that, and you can have individual plans and tailor things around that unique person. But being generally more inclusive makes things better for everybody. And as leaders, as people who work in technology, in data, whether we're people managers or not, we all generally want to be part of teams or groups of people where you can thrive, where you feel like you can be yourself. The very American term is bring your whole self to work, where people can have good days and bad days, and they can be authentic. If they're having a bad day, they can share that. But those spaces, those teams don't just magic themselves out of nowhere. They take time, they take effort, and they take leadership. And that leadership doesn't have to come from the team leader, the manager. It can come from anybody in that team. So I've left quite a bit of space for questions, for comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything I've said, answer any questions, share anything you want to know. Pretty open book. So, yeah, we will... I'm here. Thank you. So thank you very much for sharing. Could you explain a bit further about why and how starting meetings at different times helps you be on time? Yes. So I don't know why this is, and I'm assuming it's because of the way Outlook works. But meetings in YouGov and most places I've worked start at on the hour or at 30 minutes past. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It's the default setting in Outlook, right? It's not 5 past, but there's no difference. There's no difference. A 30-minute meeting can start at 5 past and end at 25 to. And we tend to have meetings that overrun. So this has been a common thing, I think, because instead of having a meeting and then having to physically move to another room, you literally jump from Zoom to Zoom. So back-to-back meetings are now way more common than they were 5 years ago. Thank you, COVID. So meetings are typically starting at, let's say it starts at 1, finishes at 2. If I'm on a one-to-one with somebody, I won't be aware of the time. I'm far more likely to have a blocked up diary than they are, because that's the nature of my job. And so it's always going to be me that has the next thing to go to and isn't aware of it. So knowing that having my next one start at 7 minutes past just gives me a little bit of wiggle room if I'm chatting and we overrun that I wouldn't have if it started on the hour. It also messes with people a little bit when you set meetings up to start at funny times. So there's no rule that says it must start on the hour or on the half hour. But if you send somebody a meeting for 7 minutes past 12, look at the reaction that you get. It's always interesting.
If you set a meeting up for... You have to wait.
Oh, I can hear you. I'll just repeat.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will project. If you set a meeting up for 7 minutes past, and quite frankly, I think that's a brilliant idea. I should stop. If you set a meeting up for what is perceived by the norm as an odd time,
Yep.
from the perspective of the person setting it up, it's absolutely acceptable. It's great. It's brilliant. But do you not find that perhaps that then generates some resistance in the non-neurodiverse colleagues, etc., that this is being done and it's not right?
Yeah.
And as such, that kicks off a confrontation.
So
Low level confrontation.
So confrontation, no. Questions, yes.
Right.
So what I've found, I do sometimes do it to troll people, honestly, because it's fun. And actually, there is no right time. It's just time. It's just a minute. But yes, it has triggered questions. Why is the meeting starting at 7 minutes past, or 13 minutes past, or 23 past? And my answer is always, well, why not? And there's no real answer for that, because why does it have to start on the hour or quarter past or half past? It's an unwritten rule that we all follow blindly. So if somebody finds that particularly challenging, one thing, and I have had a person who struggled with the concept, I try and pitch it as, well, if it starts at 7 past and finishes at 7 past, that means somebody can't block your diary for the hour immediately afterwards. So I'm actually freeing up some of your time. Please be grateful to me. And I found others do the same. So they don't quite go for 7 past, they go for 5 past. They're a little bit more mainstream, yeah. So their meetings will start at 5 past and end at 5 past, and magically 2 hours appear to be blocked in their diary for the people that are looking for things to start on the hour. And that's always a perk. More time in your day pushes meetings back by a couple of days that otherwise you'd have to do back to back.
And another question, just running off the back of meetings as well. What do you do when you don't have an agenda?
I don't go. So I have some rules.
Yeah.
I need boundaries. Boundaries are important. And one of those is if the meeting would happen, if it's a big meeting and it would happen if I was on holiday, I don't need to be there. So that's number one. If they would cancel it, reschedule it so that I could be there, probably should be attending. And then the second one is agendas. Meetings are expensive. 5, 10 people in a room, virtual room, talking for an hour. Often expensive people. Could it be a collaborative document that we all work on asynchronously? Often I find that it will be me or another neurodivergent person who suggests this. Not everything has to be talking. And sometimes pushing back just a little bit, okay, what's the agenda? Why am I being invited? What value are you expecting me to add? It is really important. But yeah, meetings without agendas. What's the purpose? What's the goal? How is this a valuable use of my time and a use of company money? Ooh.
Sarah, for folks who this has resonated with your experience, what are the next steps you would recommend folks take?
So, good question. So, I think whatever it is, whether it's ADHD, Asperger's, it doesn't really matter. If something is making sense to you and you're feeling seen, then read. So, it sounds crazy, but TikTok has got a ton of resources on this, and they're short because it's TikTok. Instagram's got loads. There's blog posts. And all of that's sort of on the self-diagnosis end of the spectrum, right through to peer-reviewed journals that talk about time blindness and have measured it and done controlled experiments to look at it. I'm not going to get too political because it's not politics platform. But the waiting time for NHS diagnosis for anything like this is like years if you're lucky. 2 years, yeah. It's not easy. So I was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD and had to dig out my school reports. My mom had to sort of be interviewed to talk about how I was as a kid. Because it has to have been present in childhood. You find as well that, again, gender's a thing, right? People still think of ADHD as a naughty boy thing. The kid at the back of the classroom causing trouble, and it's not. In girls, it can be being quite reserved and, for me, skiving off school to go and make daisy chains in a field. Not what you think about when you think of ADHD. So research, definitely. Your GP is the first port of call. I was really lucky. I had a good one. But I went private, and it shouldn't be that way. But it is at the moment, yeah. But definitely explore it. Don't let it go. And the other thing is that some of the tools, techniques, some I've mentioned, there are others online, will help even without a diagnosis, right? So the medication might not be available to you, but the coaching is. the reading, the discussions with your bosses, and in terms of what you'd like them to try to do differently, you can still do that.
I just had a couple of observations rather than questions, sorry.
Oz, you're that person.
I'm that person, sorry. Mainly for people, so Asperger's is no longer used as a term. Autism spectrum disorder now covers all aspects of autism, and Asperger's isn't used. Within the autistic community, because I'm friendly autistic, it is also not used because it refers to Hans Asperger, who did experiments on autistic children to find out whether or not they were valuable to society. So we don't like it. People who were diagnosed with Asperger's are autistic.
I get that. I hear what you're saying. I also know people who call themselves Aspies.
I do, I know,
choice,
and I do as well. But it's just a thing for people to keep in mind in general.
Yeah, that's fair.
Also, as a random aside, there is a disproportionate number of queer people in the autistic community. Just a useful thing to keep in mind. You're in a hurry? You've got questions.
Oh, no, not in a hurry, just ready to...
Looming.
Sorry.
Thank you for that.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, as a autistic person in the workplace, are there any sort of sites or things you particularly recommend that sort of look official to show a manager? Because obviously, I could go and look up stuff on TikTok or wherever and say, yeah, I'd like this adjustment, that would be really useful. But is there any sort of like stuff that looks official, TM, or particular sites where I can say, yeah, no, I really do need to start at 9:30 in the morning. I can turn up at 9, but I won't make any sense. You know.
So I will let you jump in. So the rule or the guidance is reasonable adjustments, right? So it's not reasonable adjustments as defined by this reputable looking body. It's reasonable adjustments that are going to help you deliver your best work, be your best self at work. So whether it's a recommended thing or not, there's no harm in asking. So start from what you want and think about how reasonable that is for your employer to deliver. Maybe a bit controversially, I don't know, but I find some of the National Autistic Society has a ton of resources. I worked for an autism charity for 4 years, and I always found those and others to be a little bit like operating on the assumption that people were in low-level jobs. And I know that sounds awful, but that's how it felt, right?
A lot of stuff I find seems to be assuming that you're a child.
Yes.
And I wasn't diagnosed until I was like 30-something.
Yeah.
So.
They do tend to be, your job is filling up, one example was putting tablets, working in a pharmacy, putting tablets in bottles, not kind of brain work. If you find anything, let me know, honestly. But that's why I'm mentioning social networks, because these are folks that have lived through it, not people trying to do a good thing, and letting their biases influence what they choose to write about.
We've got a good partner here at Microsoft. We partner with an organisation called GDS Within, and they have some really good information on their websites about neurodiversity that can help give to your boss and say, well, Microsoft talks to these people.
Also, the National Autistic Society have guides on how you can make your workplace more autism friendly.
Okay.
Something like that.
Do you want to?
Do you want
Oh,
this
you
back?
need the box.
Trying not to queue up. Yeah. Right, so I'm currently pre-diagnosis and I should find out in a couple of weeks. I've mentioned it to my boss and he says, okay, what do you need? Because I'm very, very lucky in this position. But equally, when I mentioned it to my boss, I'd got screenshots of the National Autistic Society website. I had a PowerPoint deck. This is a screenshot of my test results. This is page X with a link. This is page Y with a link. This is the Norfolk Health Authority resources, etc., etc. So I had everything there, which is symptomatic anyway, before I went to him, and they've been really, really good. So, but yeah, it's just build the evidence up, I would say, beforehand. Oh.
So just a short one. The spiky profile you mentioned, is it a specific test?
There are a few. So the one I've used is a company called Connections in Mind. And they have a tool on their website that looks at this. It's executive function challenges. You can fill it in. It's free. You have to give them an email address. That's the deal. But it doesn't have to be a real one. Any other questions? We've got probably time for one more. Or maybe two.
Yeah. Thanks. So, what you said there about GPs, my GP, well, he was about as helpful as a lump of ice. Well, I only found out within the past year that I was autistic. Apparently, I've had it all. Well, I knew that I had epilepsy all my life since I was 2.5, but never knew I had autism. And like you just mentioned there, it was autism, Asperger's syndrome. Yeah. But my parents always said I was technical minded and have an eye for detail. When Mum and Dad used to get electricians or tradesmen to the house, I always used to watching how they were doing their jobs. And at one time I actually fixed a problem with our boiler that the plumber had missed. He couldn't find where the leak was coming from. I found out it was only something small. He had pressed the wrong switch on the boiler, apparently.
You have a knack for understanding how things work.
And I just had an extension built, and I've learned all about building in 4 months. So I could actually tell you how to build a brick pillar. Yeah. I've done speech on electric wiring, building foundations. I work as a counsellor, .NET development manager. But when I told my GP about it, basically they didn't want to know. Yeah. They said they only deal with autism in children. They don't deal with autism in adults. So it's basically stuff you, knows what they said.
You can get pushed from pillar to post as well.
Stuff you.
Local councils on the one hand, NHS on the other, and they don't want to work together. And a manager at work, he wouldn't even consider me for a team leader position. Apparently all he sees is the autism. Yeah, I suppose sometimes I tend to get bogged down in detail and where I need to look. He only wants sort of the big picture, but he doesn't want to know the detail. But sometimes it's the detail that matters. So there's no difference between something working and not working. Yeah, it can be incredibly hard.
But certainly, I've been amazed at this event, because I've never been to one of these SQL bit events before, and I've been amazed just how wonderfully friendly and supportive everyone has been.
It's really inclusive.
I certainly. And because I thought it would just be all technical, I had no idea there'd be all this involved. I'd talk about disabilities, which I do think myself is wonderful.
It is. It's one of the best events for that. I think we have one more question, maybe, if we have time. That's all right. Thank you, Mary.
Hi.
Hello.
Only if I don't take everyone's time, just a little question that you talked about deadlines, and you actually like those. Can you maybe tell in a few words what do you do to make up with those, and maybe there are some techniques that you developed or some tools that you use to make those deadlines?
Yes, deadlines. Yes. So having them set for me is helpful. So little things like, if I'm asked to do something, I've trained my brain to say, when would you like it by? Then I'll get an answer. And then, is that a hard deadline or is that just a preference? So actually understanding the difference between the two has been really important to me. But honestly, it's something I still find really hard. I will meet hard deadlines, preferences, sometimes not. But for me, it's asking the question. And if I know that it's a hard deadline, it's fixed, it's important to the person I'm meeting that deadline for, then generally it will get hit. But I need the pressure. So you have to kind of force that for yourself. I think we are out of time. Yes, we are, in fact, over time. So thank you very much, everybody. Please scan and leave feedback. And yeah, come talk to me afterwards if you want.